This podcast is sponsored by Picmonic. In 2011, two medical students came up with the ingenious idea to combine medical education with unforgettable characters and ridiculously memorable stories. Featuring over 35,000 high-yield facts and graphics, Picmonic has helped over 600,000 students improve exam scores and perform better clinically. Picmonic has resources for pre-med and medical students, as well as other healthcare professions. Check out the show notes for a link to their website. Mention the podcast when you subscribe. With Picmonic, you can study less, but remember more.
The Black Doctors Podcast highlights the stories of minority professionals with the goal of inspiring others. If you like what you hear, please subscribe and share with others, because the next generation can't be what they don't see. Tune in every Monday to hear our stories told by us.
Hello and welcome back to the Black Doctors Podcast. I'm Steven, your host. Today I'm so excited to be speaking with Dr. Shirlene Obuobi, better known as Shirley Whirl, MD, on social media. I can't tell you what a pleasure it is. We were both at University of Chicago when she was a medical student. I was a resident, so our paths crossed. And in the years since, I've seen her grow and blossom into her new role as an artist, as an influencer for good, for change, and who really has a very empowering and passionate story to tell, which she tells through a number of different mediums, which we'll get into further today. Dr. Obuobi, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Dr. Bradley. It's a pleasure, and thanks for that introduction.
You have had an incredibly busy year, so it does mean a lot that you're able to carve aside some time to come and share some of the things that you're passionate about with us.
Oh, it's no problem at all. It's between old friends.
So let's start by getting a little into your backstory. You're Ghanaian American, and you talk about your parents and kind of how you were raised.
Yeah, for sure. So I was born in Ghana. We moved to the United States when I was 6 years old. I am second generation doctor, right? So my mom is a physician. She trained in Ghana and actually came to the United States to complete her residency in pediatrics now. She's currently working as a neonatologist. And so kind of in the course of that, she actually came ahead of us. She came to the States about a year before we did. And the plan was initially that she would come back and work in Ghana. But of course, as all plans go, things kind of went a little bit awry. So we ended up coming here. And I always joke that I later found out that I asked my parents, like, why didn't we go back to Ghana? And they were like, we didn't have money for the plane tickets. So that's why I'm American. And so we moved around quite a bit. We actually started off in Chicago, where she finished her training in Cook County. And then we went to a very small town in Malvern, Arkansas, then to the Woodlands, Texas. I went to college at Washington University in St. Louis, and then completed all of my medical training so far, meaning medical school, residency, and now my Cardiology Fellowship at University of Chicago. So as far as kind of how my parents raised me, my dad is trained as an engineer, but we have a slightly different, I guess, non-traditional family structure in that, he's the one who kind of gave up his job when he came here so that we can keep the family together. And so by and large, he was a stay-at-home dad as I was growing up. And so I think a lot of my work ethic and a lot of my drive comes from my dad. He's always been, he was the one he was like, Shirlene, you're a genius. And I'm like, you are bugging. But he's always pushed me to do the absolute most, always had very high expectations for me and helped me have high expectations for myself. And I think I owe a lot of how I am and who I am to that drive.
We have to shout out the parents because they've had so much of an impact on us becoming who we are. So Shirlene, as you advance your education, you finished at Washington University, St. Louis, you attended medical school at Pritzker. You're the first Pritzker grad I've had in the show, to my knowledge. Can you talk a little bit about what drew you to that school and that program?
Yes, for sure. So, my artistic and creative pursuits are not something new. They're something I've actually been doing since I was a child, and something I've been prioritizing and trying to bring into my studies since high school, right? And so when I was applying for medical school, I did fairly well on the trail, but one thing that kind of was important for me was for the things I brought to the table to be really appreciated and to thought of as valuable and not as an extra thing. And I'll go into this a little bit later, but one thing that's been important for me is that I don't just do the creative pursuits. I try my best to check all the other boxes as well. And that's advice I give to other people who come to me, medical school hopefuls or residency hopefuls, cardiology hopefuls who are like, oh, I want to do what you're doing. And I'm like, look, the system is not necessarily built to let you just do creative pursuits. You also have to do everything else. So I felt that Pritzker was one of the few places that when I talked about things like diversity and equity, actually cared about it. And I felt that they were one of the few places too that, and specifically two people, Dr. Monica Vela and Dr. Tony Montag, who I interviewed with, right, who actually seemed to see my creative pursuits as a boon. I always joke that Dr. Montag, he's unfortunately has passed, but when he interviewed me, we actually didn't talk about medicine. We talked about our favorite books, right? That was the entire interview, right? And so that made me feel very welcome at Pritzker. I also had Victoria Thomas, who's currently a cardiology fellow, I believe she's at IU, who had been reaching out and like answering lots of questions. And so I had someone, a Black woman kind of already ahead of me, who's already kind of knew the lay of the land, who kind of assured me, well, she didn't just assure me of the safety of it, of the Pritzker. She told me about like all the sides, the good sides, the bad sides, right? Which I really appreciated coming in, like knowing what I was going to get into. So I felt like I was going to be accepted into a safe space that kind of valued me. And that's how I kind of ended up there.
And the familiar names really taking me home because, again, seeing all you guys as, young, aspiring medical students running around, so full of energy, and realizing that you guys are all fellows and attendings now. One, it makes me feel old, but hopefully I probably didn't have much to do with any of your successes, but I'll think I did. Speaking of which, and you mentioned the diversity, equity, and inclusion because... Yes, I just patted myself on the back. Back in 2014, to note, that's when you were kind of coming into medical school. So to be thinking about DEI work and being able to bring that up and finding a program that was supportive of that was an even bigger deal back then because we've definitely had a blossom of efforts in this space. So it does speak to kind of the heart of some of the physicians at that program that are still very invested in diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yes, I think that it's fortunately and unfortunately become very sexy to be into diversity and equity and inclusion in a way that it really wasn't back then. Back then, it was not denigrated exactly, but thought of as kind of soft. It's still underfunded, and I can go on and on about how a lot of the people who really pushed it forward are now being pushed to the back.
Right.
And people who otherwise were not interested are now kind of using it as a way to get academic relevance. But I mean, I'm sleep though.
We're just warming up.
Is that going to get cut?
Oh, no. Oh, I cut very little. So going to your website, ShirleneObuobi.com, I love that it says writer, artist, doctor in no particular order. And as I was researching for this interview, seeing that you really started to channel some of that art and creativity during medical school. And having been an artist and engaged in that your entire life, what was special about that time as a third-year medical student?
There are a lot of things. I think that I actually started my comics in second year. I just didn't post them largely for people to see at the time. I just posted them within my Pritzker Facebook groups when those were still a thing. But I think third year in particular is this very strange time. It's the first time that you're actually going from the classroom and onto the wards, and you have to translate all of this knowledge, a lot of it basic science, a lot of it not really relevant to the bedside, right? And now you're negotiating all of these relationships with attendings, residents, fellows. You're kind of like, your role is a little bit hazy. You're being evaluated. It's unclear what you're being evaluated on, but like the evaluations matter. And it's all the work that you put in for the however long you've been going for medicine, for years, for most of us, like most of our lives, right? Kind of comes down to those years in medical school, right? Because if you mess up, right, maybe your dream of pursuing orthopedic surgery is down the drain, right? And so it's a very high pressure time, and while also being a strange time because you're there for your education, but patients still need to be taken care of, right? Like, and so I always joke that med school is a time, especially your clinical years, it's a time where every med student's a little bit like just a little narcissistic. Like, and I'm including myself in that 100%, right? In that, like, you know, people are sick, but you have to still think about your grade and how you're being seen. And you still have to like kind of dance a little dance, right? And you need to get people to like you. And so you kind of, in a way, like are playing at doctor. That's why I always use like the baby doctor, but you're also like training, right? You're playing a doctor in the sense that you still have to perform. You still have to, you're listening feedback. You're hoping that the things that you're doing get you a good grade, not necessarily the things that you're doing influence patient care. So it's a completely different time. And that paradigm switches entirely in residency, in my opinion, right? Where it stops really being like, I don't know about you, but like when I was in residency, I like cared a lot less about what people thought of me and a lot more about like taking care of patients and getting my work done, right? And if as a consequence, my hard work was noted, that would be great. Like if it wasn't, I was like, okay. And so I think because of all those kind of conflicting emotions and feelings, there was just a lot of material during third year of med school that I think wasn't around as much in the preclinical years.
And so you continued to write these cartoon strips and pieces of work. You were still sharing them with your classmates, but what pushed you to start sharing them with the rest of the world?
Yeah, my best friend, Linda, I gas her all the time because we are so close. She was the one who actually pushed me to share it with the rest of the world. I was content to stay in my little bubble for quite some time. And she was like, look, like maybe you can do something with this. And so that's how I ended up posting it initially on Facebook, eventually on Instagram.
What was that response that you received?
You know, I think that by and large, the response, even back then and still now, the response to Shirley Whirl is a lot of people almost seem to be exhaling. They're like, oh, gosh, me too. Right. This is the stuff that we don't talk about, that you're supposed to, as in medicine, be ever confident. You're never supposed to complain. You're never supposed to be worried about your abilities. And in a lot of ways, medical training encourages stoicism. And I think being able to visually represent that I wasn't necessarily feeling that, like I was feeling feelings or having emotions, having responses to things that other people empathized with, was like a source of catharsis for people. And so I think by and large, it's been well received.
I think back to some of the things that you've written and posted. And, you know, one of the pieces that really spoke to me was a scene from your childhood, because as we know, Black and other minority children aren't necessarily allowed to just be kids. So it really resonated with me, the experience you had at a hotel room playing with your siblings.
Yes, that was a formative experience for me growing up. And I think one familiar to a lot of Black people growing up in America. And it was really important for me to share that experience. I think in the height of, this was June 2020, George Floyd had just been murdered. And I felt as though, as Black people in America, we kept getting re-traumatized. We're like being reminded over and over again how little we matter and how little our lives matter, right, to this judicial system, to America as a whole. And so I think that for me, I think frequently as Black doctors, we're kind of looked upon as, exceptions or as exceptional, I suppose, right? That we've done all of the things that you're supposed to do that somehow grant you honorary whiteness. I really wanted to disabuse people of that notion with this comic, right? To say that, like my family, my mom was a physician, and this happened in the town where she was a physician. She was the only pediatrician taking care of everybody in the community, right? And me and my siblings were children. I think I must have been, I don't remember how old I was exactly. I put it in the comic. But, we're children and I'm sure everybody's had other experiences, right? Like I think every kid, regardless of race, can know of a time that they were disrupted because they were having fun, right? And the fact of the matter is that having fun and being disruptive, which is like goes hand in hand with childhood, was considered criminal, right? In that case, and my whole family were let out by police. Can you imagine? And I think that was that I feel like that comic resonated for a few reasons. I think some people felt that they saw themselves in it. And then I think a lot of people who've never experienced this before, which is, it's sometimes hard for me to dig into empathy for that too, to
Right.
be like, wow, what a charmed existence, right? That you get to make mistakes. You get the benefit of the doubt. You know what I mean? My husband's white, and sometimes we compare childhoods, and it's wild, right? Like the things that he was able to do and mistakes he was able to make that I could never dream of making because I would never be given the benefit of the doubt. I wouldn't be able to move on and be successful. I would be punished, right? I think that it opened eyes for those other people, and also, of course, invited people who came in to tell me that if I just followed the rules,
Right.
right? So it just demonstrated what like the message that's been given to Black people in America has been. So it's one of my
Yeah.
favorites too.
And the cartoon in question, for those of you that have not seen it, your beautiful drawing, very descriptive, the facial expressions that you have in your art, and it shows some Black children who, for the crime of playing too loudly in a hotel, had to experience the weaponization of police when they were called on them, and then the whole family being removed from the hotel. And the way that you drew these images just told the story in such a powerful way. So definitely, you'll have to scroll back through the Shirley Whirl MD Instagram, and that's one of my favorite pieces. The second one, it also kind of deals with that aspect of being seen and being exceptional, as you said, in these hallways, because you entitled it Mirrors, and you told a story about walking down the halls of University of Chicago, Pritzker School of Medicine, and trying to find a Black female physician within the pictures of the graduating classes. Can you share a little bit about the inspiration behind that?
Yes, for sure. So it's inspired from a few places. One of them is that I genuinely used to do that, right? You'd walk that when University of Chicago puts up their graduating classes along a few hallways in their old hospital and administrative building. And I remember walking to class and looking at the faces on the walls. And the classes start like in the late 1930s, early 1940s, and not seeing anyone who looked like me, right? Starting off, I mean, initially the filter assistant would be, oh, where are the women? And the women show up pretty early. They're white. There's a couple in every class, typically starting from the 1940s. You start seeing Black men filter in, probably honestly in greater numbers than there are today. Right.
Yeah.
Sometimes around like somewhere around the 1960s, 1970s. And it takes a while before you finally see a Black woman. And I think it just goes to show like those boundaries have been, the barriers of entry have been there forever. And what I found really beautiful about that exercise is that, once one person kicked that door open, the door stayed open. Right. We just needed to have someone break that barrier. And after she broke the barrier, other Black women, like I think that the very next class, there's a Black woman, right? And the class after that, and then a couple skips here and there, but we appear, and I think that it goes. I find that reflected in even what I'm doing now. I'm in a Cardiology Fellow. I don't know how long exactly it's been since there was another Black female Cardiology Fellow at University of Chicago, but it has most certainly been over a decade, right, in Southside Chicago, which is shameful. But I mean, it's the last Black man was Emeka, who graduated 3 years ago, right? So
one of my
it's not
classmates.
great. Yeah, exactly. And I find that just being there is powerful in and of itself. Just being there and being visible has its own, it redefines what a physician or a cardiologist is supposed to look like, right? It is important for my patients, who look like me, right? I think like it helps with our interactions, right? And I think more than anything, like it's not just about having Black people there for the sake of having Black people. It's about, in some parts, cultural competence, right? It's about valuing what different people and what diversity brings to the table. And I think that what I especially like about Mirrors is that it also includes a call to action, right? Like it says, look, like, we can't be out here knowing that having physicians share experiences with patients is important for patient care, and knowing that it helps outcomes. we can't be out here not recruiting, not recognizing Black talent, right? I think that academic medicine loves, like I said this before, about having to check all the boxes before. They love the 15 Black applicants a year who check the boxes, right? They don't want to give anything up that has to do with the boxes. They want Black candidates who are exactly the same as white candidates, but dipped in chocolate, right? So they can have them on the diversity posters, right? And I think that does a huge service to hospitals, and I think it also, it's a loss, right? So one of the things I ask for, I call for in the comic is, more recruitment from HBCUs, right? Like the fact of the matter is HBCUs still train the largest proportion of Black medical students, right? And a lot of these, especially quote unquote elite institutions, don't recruit from them. Don't really accept people, residents from these institutions. And I think that's, I think that's not okay for a variety of reasons. But one of them being that, that's where Black physicians are being trained, right? And so that was one of the things I called for. And one thing that I really appreciated about my University of Chicago residency program is that they listened. This current intern class, like a significant number are from HBCUs and a significant number are Black. It's wonderful. It's not just, two.
Yeah, because of change that you in part affected. And I think going back to that piece, it's so translatable because across the country in our ivory towers of higher education, that feeling is translatable. You walk down the halls, and if you're a non-white person, everybody on the wall does not look like you. And, does it make you feel welcome to be in an institution where nobody on the wall looks like you? It's something that, some people may not be aware of how that feels if they've never been in our shoes or had that experience.
Right. And I think even more than just the feeling, right? Because, people sometimes brush off feelings as important as they are. It's like, what does it translate to in terms of mentorship, right? How often do people choose who they want to mentor based on how well they see themselves in the next person, right? Like, we like to talk about how people of color mentor people of color frequently, but the fact is, like, white men mentor white men, right? And being like not reminding somebody of their son or of themselves at a younger age, like, is detrimental to your career, right? And so I think that's part of it too, is that you have to open up these pipelines. And I talk pretty frequently on Shirley Whirl about how, it's not entirely just diversity of, like, in terms of race or gender or like religious background. It's also recruiting people who are also empowered by this mission so that they can, like, take some of the load off of the very few Black physicians that there are, right? Like, they should be also mentoring Black medical students and Black residents and other Black hopefuls, right? Like, to get into their fields. It should not just be on us. And unfortunately, quite frequently, it ends up being that way.
Yeah, absolutely, which leads to another concept which has had several publications in the last year referring to it, the minority tax, where you and I are in these positions, and because we are underrepresented minorities in medicine, Black people, we shoulder a heavier burden in terms of increasing the diversity that we see around us and furthering diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. What's been your experience with that?
So I absolutely, I love talking about the minority tax, right? Because I think that it is something that I'm glad that people are talking about more, but previously really wasn't discussed. And, I think that basically throughout my entire academic career, starting from college onwards, once I entered an institution, the expectation from that institution was that I would help recruit people who looked like me to come after me, right? And that expectation was not necessarily, it was not something I was paid for. It was not something I would ever be able to put on my resume, even though it was incredibly time consuming. And of course, it was something that I felt, and I feel like many of us feel like I must do because someone did it for me, right? And I was not about to pull up the ladder behind me. The problem with this is that, it's why are the institutions having us do this, right? And it's not necessarily because they actually want to improve the representation for the sake of the students. It's mostly so that they can kind of check some metrics, right? And do they truly value these things? And in my opinion, what I've kind of grown to how I've grown to feel is that the things you value, you're willing to pay for, right?
Yeah.
And if you're not willing to pay for it, it's not something you consider valuable. And what happens instead is that, I think that in these institutions, we get recruited to do a lot of free labor,
Yes.
right,
Yeah.
to bring people on after us. And I see this replicated in lots of ways. I recently gave a talk to the Pritzker medical students, right? And I started it by telling them by asking them, why do they think I'm here? Why am I here? I'm a cardiology fellow. I was currently on consults. I was getting slammed, right? I'm like, why am I here instead of anybody else, right? In my cardiology fellowship class, right? Why is anybody who's talking to them today, who's a trainee and who's not getting paid for this here? It's because we are Black and brown or underrepresented in some other way. And the expectation is that we come here and do this additional work to educate other people, right? Just so that we can maintain our lines, right?
Yeah.
And, it's something that is, I don't exactly know how to fix it, aside from by saying that, we need to be able to get credit for it, right? It needs to be something that's valued the way research is valued, because I always tell people, if I'm spending time writing presentations to give, or spending time reviewing people's applications or providing mentorship, that's time that my white male colleagues are spending churning out papers, right, and working on academic things that will actually move them further in their careers. This is not doing anything for me,
right.
Aside from giving me, of course, a sense of fulfillment. I found in fellowship that's unfortunately, because I'm one of very few, one of the onlys, right, that has grown exponentially. It means that, and not just in terms of people who are reaching out for help, right, which I can understand, right, but even from faculty, I was asked to help interview residents, which I declined, right, because I felt that it was part of the minority tax, right? Because I'm like, there is no other fellow being asked to interview residents, on the day before Thanksgiving too. I was like,
no.
There's no other fellow. It's not my job, right? I'm not being paid for this, right? And the hope is that I will say yes, because you've attached that, we need underrepresented minorities to be present during the interview day, So I think that the only ways to make this better, right, are to really at an institutional level, value it. I think that it should be something that is regarded as, and it is, a lot of the mentorship work we do is valuable, right? I think it only gets, if we get something back from it, right? Then then it can be something that can be demanded of us. But at this moment, all of us are just doing it for free. I'm sure, Stephen, you're doing a ton of mentorship, and you're doing I'm sure you're doing
for
a
the
ton
culture,
for free, right? And for the culture, imagine how much time you would have to do other things if you were not constantly toiling for the culture, which I consider a privilege, but it's still, it's still labor.
Yeah.
I went on a whole rant about
this.
And
we could keep going, but we definitely need to talk about how you make time for everything that you do, because in addition to being in an extremely busy cardiology fellowship, you're also an incredibly accomplished author and artist. We've seen your work. We know you've written a book, which we'll talk about very shortly. But when it comes to managing these pretty much 3 different careers, how do you do it?
It's not easy. It takes a lot of, it's multitasking. It takes a lot of planning. I think I joke that I used to say I was laid back, and I'm not anymore because every minute of my time is pretty budgeted for, right? And that includes rest. So initially with Shirley Whirl, I've always been someone who can draw and pay attention. It helps me pay attention, honestly, to be doing something with my hands. And so it meant that during rounds, I'm drawing most of the time, right? And during a presentation, I'm probably drawing, right? And that and I don't really watch TV shows or listen to podcasts or really do anything idle unless I'm doing something else at the same time, right? And so, which for better or for worse, right? Because of course it means that I don't necessarily, it means that everything I do, even when in leisure is a little bit, I'm working at the same time. With my writing, I wrote my book largely while walking across the hospital, right? I had a Google Doc
Wow.
and I just churned at it. And on the weekend, yeah, it was definitely like a going up and down the halls of the CCD, like taking breaks in between admissions, and then I would have the occasional day off where I would basically do nothing but sit in a robe with a blanket and write. Now, these things revitalize me. Creating revitalizes me. It helps me process, and it's being productive makes me feel good,
Yeah.
right? So that is a huge reason why I do it. I always say on Shirley Whirl that it's like my own. I mean, I do therapy too, right? But it's my form of self therapy, right? Where I get to some time to really process my emotions and my feelings and my thoughts in this very tangible kind of creative way that I can then present to the world. So,
And I think one of the things that I love about you is you set boundaries. And I don't know how you've come, I'm sure there's been a process to get to where you are today, but you make no bones about it that this is, when you need your time, there's your time. You are a model of what it means to be able to take control and set boundaries.
It's very funny. It's not my natural state. I had a high school teacher actually pull me aside and told me, Shirlene, you need to start telling people no. Right. And so it is very much a learned behavior for me. I think it started off from necessity, right? That, the thing about my natural state is to be very, very giving, right? Like I enjoy giving. I enjoy forming relationships with people. And I will pour out my entire cup if I'm not careful for people that I care about, and sometimes even for people I don't, right? So boundaries are a way to patrol myself as well as other people. I think that often without them, I think this is especially pertinent to Black women, people feel very entitled to Black women's time and energy and talents, right? And we are very rarely thought of in the reverse, right? Like people very rarely stop and think, I wonder whether Shirlene has like the bandwidth for this or needs that. Like there's a lot of it is often, what can I get from this person, right? And so I think that as I went further in my career and as especially my following grew, it became untenable, right? Like it was literally not possible for me to be able to do what I loved and to continue loving doing what I was doing without making it clear that there were certain things I wouldn't stand for, right? And I think it's a hard thing to do. I think we're trained out of defining our boundaries, especially in medicine.
Right.
I think in medicine is like medical training, residency training is I joke, but I think it's very real that we are literally like trained for years to disrespect the heck out of our bodies and our needs, right? And so I really do it step by step. I practiced doing it in person. I practiced not necessarily mincing words in person, right? I practiced saying no, and I set up things like, as you noticed with my email, if you try to email me, it gives you back a return thing saying, I'm not doing any of this, right?
Yes, it did.
And it sure did, right? And I put that in place because otherwise I was spending, there was a point where I was spending 2 hours a day responding very kindly to people and respectfully to people about why I wasn't able to do something, right? And it was taking up time and was causing me stress, right? And so that is something. And I mean, I also think that when it comes to especially having a following, right? Like being a quote unquote influencer, it's such a weird term. I have 30,000 followers right now, which is 29,000. It's awesome. It's a little bit insane to think about. We can round up, right? Exactly. And like a lot of them engage fairly frequently, right? The thing about social media is that I think it's really easy for people to, and especially because my presence is very open, right? Like I'm pretty much who I am online as I am in person. I'm like, I use it like a diary half the time, right? And so I think it's easy for people to forget that, they don't know me.
Yeah.
I'm not their little friend. And that they're not actually entitled to me. And so it became incredibly necessary in order to make Shirley Whirl something I could continue doing, to be very firm about like what I was going to tolerate and what I wasn't. So that's how the boundary setting started.
It's absolutely fabulous. Definitely keep it up. And I'm taking notes. So, Dr. Obuobi, we have to talk about your magnum opus, that book that you wrote while you were walking around in the halls of the hospital. It's even more incredible hearing the backstory. Very soon, On Rotation is going to be available. Can you tell us about this book? What inspired it, and of course, when and where people can pick it up.
For sure. And so I've been writing for basically my entire life. It's kind of gone hand in hand with the drawing. On Rotation was first dreamed up when I was a second or third year medical student. And Juno Diaz, who was the writer of The Brief and Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde, came to University of Chicago to give a talk. And during the talk, he spoke directly to the writers of color who were in the room. And this is at a time when, the only major writers of color or contemporary ones were like Chimamanda Adichie, like a hand, like it was like 2, 3 people, like not too many people.
Wow.
And Juno Diaz himself. And he said to the room, look, as people of color, we don't see ourselves represented accurately or as fully human in media. And because of that, it impacts how we treat others and it impacts how we treat ourselves, right? It impacts how we treat people in our own in-group because we, in a lot of ways, you haven't practiced empathy for your own people, right?
Yeah.
And that he said something that really struck me where he was like, a lot of us are scared of writing about ourselves because we don't think we're worth it, right?
Wow.
And he was like, white writers write about themselves all the time. If you actually start paying attention, you'll realize that most of the protagonists in books are writers and or lawyers, because a lot of lawyers are writers, right? There's only a few careers or main characters are allowed to have in these things, right? And so he was like, you're the one who can tell your story, so write about characters like yourselves. And I was like, oh shit, I can actually do that. And before that, I hadn't felt that. I remember when I was in high school, I deliberately wrote a book with a white main character because I felt like I wouldn't be a legitimate writer if I wrote about someone like me, right? Which is, so to hear that wasn't something I had just come up with, and to realize that, and I think Chimamanda Adichie actually talks about that too. Like she wrote about like snow and like white girls with blonde hair, right? Like, like while she was in Nigeria, And so that's kind of when I started thinking about it. And I wrote out I think I wrote the first few chapters of On Rotation in medical school, and then I dropped it because I got busy and I got tired. Picked it up again at the end of my intern year. And this is mostly because I had really kind of lost a connection with my writing. I hadn't done it as much, and I wanted to dive back into it. And I was stressed, and I needed something to make me to revitalize me the way my comics often do. And writing is a little bit more portable. So that's how I started it. On Rotation is, it's meant to be happy, right? Like there are a lot of very serious themes in it, right? But it's not meant to be the kind of book someone picks up and is like, this is the day I'm going to learn about Black womanhood, right? Which is Ghanaian American culture. Like I wanted those things to be like picked up via osmosis, right? That like I would have a character that felt very real, that dealt with a lot of the issues that Black female medical students would deal with, like that, while also just being about like, I don't know, her kicking it with her friends and like having regular issues and like worrying about exams and falling in love. You know what I mean? Like I just wanted something that wasn't, I was like, I don't want this to be heavy. I have a film agent, which is incredible. And she described it as like my book being like a Sunday or something. She's like, it's joyful at the end. You know what I mean? Like it's just, and that's what I wanted. I wanted something that people would feel happy after they were done reading, like, and that they would laugh, and that there would be occasional moments where, like they may experience some heartache, but it would get fixed, and I didn't want it to be about suffering.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to write more. I sometimes have to pinch myself to be like, oh my gosh, I'm published now. HarperCollins, the book comes out June 21st, 2022. It's already available via pre-order basically everywhere the books are sold. If you check out the link and go to my Shirlene Obuobi link.bio, you'll be able to see, get access to the link to pre-order. And also, if you're a bookseller or a book blogger, you can request an advanced reading copy and get a hold of it before June. But I don't know, it's something that it's probably like the realization of one of my earliest childhood dreams. So I still am a little bit shocked that it's happening, but it's very exciting.
We're here for it. I've really enjoyed being along with you on this ride through your social media and all the things that you're doing. We will for sure include a link to pick up this book in the show notes, along with a link to your website. If you want to learn more about Dr. Obuobi, visit her website, Shirlene Obuobi. That's Obuobi spelled Obuobi, ShirleneObuobi.com. You can see her beautiful website. Shirlene, where else can people follow you and find out more?
Sure. So my Instagram is at Shirley Whirl MD. It's also my handle on Facebook, and on Twitter I'm Shirlene Obuobi, just my name. So if you want to keep track of me, I drop lots of hot takes on all of the platforms.
All of them really good. Dr. Obuobi, thank you so much. I have really enjoyed the last half hour, 45 minutes talking with you, catching up from our days back at Pritzker, which we will soon be reunited. So guys, keep an eye out for me in one of these Shirley Whirl comic book strips.
You know it. It'll be so fun.
Can't wait. Thank you so much for joining us on the Black Doctors Podcast, because representation matters.
Thank you, Dr. Bradley.
The Black Doctors Podcast is a nonprofit, volunteer passion project with the goal of inspiring all who listen. If you enjoy listening, tell a friend about the show or share a link on social media. We are a small team and can use all the help we can get. You can reach us at the Black Doctors Podcast on Instagram or at Stephen Bradley MD on Twitter or Instagram. Tune in next week for another episode of the Black Doctors Podcast, because representation matters.